Welcome to this June meeting of the Audubon Society of Central Arkansas. And I'm really excited that we have Dr. Jeremy Cohen with us this evening. For those who you probably have all read Jeremy's bio, but Jeremy is an associate research scientist in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University. And I have met Jeremy through doing eBird reviewing because Jeremy is kind of our go-to distribution person to help us understand filters and distribution. And that's a small area of how Jeremy's knowledge and research touches on how we understand birds here in Arkansas. But Jeremy looks at much bigger data sets and is working to understand how large climate events and trends are affecting bird distribution. And so that's what he's going to share with us a little bit about this evening. So Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today. Great turnout. So I moved to Arkansas in January of 2021, and I was really excited. I was coming from Wisconsin, so I was really excited for mild winters, opportunity to bike outside in January, February, things like that. But then a month later, this happened. Hang on one second. This happened. So this is probably still fresh in everyone's memory. A couple of years ago, got hit with -20 wind chill, so don't forget about that too quickly. Negative temperatures for, I think it was like 4 or 5 days straight. Texas power grid shut down. And so instead of, huddling up by the fireplace like a normal person, I was glued to the window the entire time because the birds in the yard were acting bonkers. So a good example are the robins pictured here. I took this picture out my window. If you feed birds, you're probably aware that, robins aren't traditionally a feeder bird. You might occasionally get one at your feeder, but usually you don't see something like this with 60 robins crowding around a feeder. The robins on the ground are kind of acting like pigeons, just huddled up in a tight group, trying to find any food that they can. And so what you're seeing here is just pure desperation. So during this polar vortex event, the birds were just, trying to do whatever they could to find food. It was really difficult with the snow cover, with the extreme cold weather. And so when they weren't kind of huddled up, around the feeder, trying to get whatever food they could, they were huddled up against the side of my house, just trying to absorb whatever heat that they could from the house. So I thought this was really interesting, coming from having just spent a couple of years in Wisconsin doing the work that I'm about to present today, exploring how extreme weather is influencing bird, behavioral and distributional patterns. But it's really cool to kind of just see the consequences up close in my backyard like this. So today I'm going to talk about birds, hopefully something we're all excited about here, as well as the link between extreme weather and climate change is kind of a core theme, and then citizen science and big data use in ecology. So if you're on social media, you'll probably see a lot of graphics and figures that look something like this when it comes to climate change. So what's being shown here is the amount of warming, global average, above some historic baseline, in this case, 1881 to 1910. So it's just showing that for all these recent years in the past decade, it's been about a degree or 1.4 degrees Celsius. So that's anywhere from like 1.9 to 2.5 Fahrenheit above the previous average. But I really hate graphics like this for a bunch of reasons. I'm going to tell you right now. So number one is that it masks a ton of variation in space and time. So for example, land is heating much faster than the oceans. Areas that are temperate and closer to the poles are heating much faster than around the equator, tropical areas. And winter is heating a lot faster than summer. So when it comes down to it, here in Arkansas, we're actually experiencing anywhere from about 5 to 8 degrees in the summer, Fahrenheit, warmer than the historic average, and it's about 8 to 12 degrees in the winter. So a huge amount above the historic average. But even beyond that, this doesn't really touch on probably one of the most concerning aspects of warming, which is extreme weather. So I'll try to explain. So if you imagine this distribution here as a climate in a given region, So what's forming the distribution is different, but like days of weather, possible days of weather. And so most of them are huddled around the climate average for that region. Most of the days are just going to be somewhere around that average, which is why the curve is really big in that part. There's going to be a couple of really hot days that form that red part on the right. It's going to be a couple of really cool days. But if you take that curve and just shift it slightly to the right, so you just increase that average a little bit, suddenly you can see what happens to that right tail, that red tail. Suddenly, the incidence of extreme weather that's occurring on the hot end is blowing up. So you can have, 5 to 10 times as much of that really hot weather that was previously considered extreme. The curve could even be pushed into completely new territory all the way on the right, so that you have this record that hasn't been seen. So that's exactly what's happened the last 50 years. So if you look at things like floods, windstorms, droughts, things like that, they've all globally increased several fold in the last 50 years. And then this is just the US here from the EPA. We've gone from about 2 heat waves per year on average to about 6, just in the US. And so bringing this back to birds, this was kind of critical when I was starting this research position, because all of our knowledge about birds and climate change had to do with, okay, what's going to happen with their distributions when it goes up 2 or 3 degrees on average, right? What's going to happen with the timing of their breeding when it's 2 or 3 degrees warmer? What's going to happen with their physiology? Warms a little bit. But we weren't really thinking about the extremes like this at all. So the goals that I had in my research program were to ask how birds are responding to extreme weather, but a couple little sub goals. How are birds responding across different time periods? So short things like a heat wave that lasts 2 days or a polar vortex, to long-lasting weather like a drought that lasts all summer. We wanted to look at lots of different species, how different species are reacting to extreme weather. Can we find any trends where birds that have this diet react a certain way, or birds that have this body size react a certain way, so that we can then kind of extrapolate to other species. And then we want to know what's happening during, there's extreme weather that's occurring during the summer, heat waves and droughts and things like that. There's also winter extreme weather like blue vortexes. So you might be thinking this is a little data greedy. So you want data for, long periods of time where extreme weather is occurring. You want data from lots of different species, and you want it from multiple parts of the year. So that's a lot of data. So that's where eBird comes in. So eBird is a citizen science data platform that a lot of you are probably familiar with and contribute to. So it's a platform in which users submit bird checklists, so checklists of sightings. And it's called semi-structured data because there's a lot of flexibility. So birders can choose where to bird, when to bird, for how long, how much distance to cover, how many people to be involved. But all this gets recorded. So instead of being completely freeform like iNaturalist or something like that, we at least have a record of what happened so we can deal with it later statistically. And there's been over 1.5 billion records, so tons of data. There's a couple of reasons why it's been so successful. Number one, as we all know, birds are very colorful, often very obvious, hang out in the open a lot, easy to see compared with other wildlife that's a lot more cryptic, mammals and reptiles and things like that. So you can just go walk around the block and see 15, 20 species of birds often. It's fun to record that many rather than, oh, okay, squirrel, maybe a deer again, for mammals. The diversity is also really high. So there's been more birds observed in Arkansas than all other vertebrates combined. So here we have 230 fish, double digits of a couple others. And so birds outnumber all those. And it gets even more drastic when you zoom to the county level. Every county in Arkansas, I think, had something like 200, 250 birds observed. Even if you go to a backyard, in any backyard, if you wait long enough in Arkansas, you could probably see 50 species, maybe 100, and that's just not true for all of the groups. And then the eBird really took off when they realized that people just wanted their data fed back to them, packaged nicely. Birders are all about lists. And so I pulled this off my account. It's just, shows you pretty maps with all of your different state lists, and you have lists by year and things like that. So people are really into it. It's really simple to use if you haven't used it. You just basically open the app, select the location at which you're birding, enter the number of each species that you see, and then you get all this data fed back to you of how many species you've seen in the county during this year, blah, blah. So data-wise, it's been really instrumental. And before I didn't, I worked with eBird at all. It had been used by a lot of people in research to understand more about the distributions of different species, the biodiversity in space, and migration patterns and things like that. So, for example, you can take this traditional field guide map for Magnolia warblers range. You have the blue is the winter range, yellow is the migration, and then red's breeding. And then modeling eBird data, you can turn into something like this. So you can zoom this, all the way down to cells that are, 3 by 3 kilometers. So really fine scale. And so anyone at a local who's managing like a local park or something like that in any of these locations can have a much better idea of whether magnolia warblers are going to be present than with the map on the left. If you look especially at some areas like Appalachia or the boreal areas, especially out west, there's a lot more detail that's happening than on the left. So some strengths of eBird for research are that massive data volume, so you have tons of data. We're talking millions of observations of a lot of these species, especially in North America. Continuous coverage, so that's really big for us. And so what that means is that the data is collected continuously all year long in lots of different areas. And so what we can do then is when we can go back to when extreme weather occurred in the past and say, okay, we can just grab data from around that event and see what birds were doing with that event, kind of retroactively doing experiments. Another really big strength of eBird is the complete checklist aspect. So you ever wondered why eBird asks you to, record all of the birds that you observed and not just the ones that you like? It's because it's equally valuable to know when birds are not present than it is to know that birds are present. And especially for us when we're talking about extreme weather, we want to know, is it that people aren't going outside and are just not recording data and that's why the birds aren't found, or the people that actually did record data but they still didn't find these birds, so they're truly absent from the eBird. So that's really important for us to tease apart. There are some challenges with eBird. I'm not going to talk about how we address these right now because I don't have the time. But if you're curious about it, feel free to ask. But some of the challenges are the biases in space and time. So people really like to submit data, around where they live. So populated areas, really popular birding times like last month, maybe not this month as much. Weekends like the Great Backyard Bird Count get a ton of data. There's also a ton of variation in observers, so not all observers are equally skilled at detecting birds by ear, things like that. There's a lot of variation in effort, so even within a single person, you'll have a checklist that's 5 hours, then you'll have one that's 5 minutes. So there's that obviously affects whether you're likely to observe something. And then there's kind of limited temporal coverage, so there's only about 20 years of high quality dense data for eBird because it got started late. So this is just a fun animation while we're on Magnolia Warbler. I don't know if you've gone on the website and seen some of these, but they're kind of addictive. So this is just Magnolia Warbler weekly animation. So there's so much data that they can fit a model for each week of the year and find these distributions weekly and then basically create this animation out of it. But tons of high quality information about where the birds are every week. So that's cool. And they have these tons of species. Oops. Trying to click to the next slide, and it's just playing. All right. What about other data sources? So there's a couple others that you might have contributed to. So the Christmas bird count through Audubon, it's really valuable. It's over 100 years old, I think. And so if you want to look at long-term trends, that's really valuable. The breeding bird survey is nice because the expertise of the people participating is a little bit higher than eBird on average. And it's also more systematic in terms of, equally sampling all the different areas. But both of these only occur once per year. So if you want to, go back to some extreme weather event that happened in February, for instance, you're going to be out of luck with both of these. So that's where eBird is really nice. So we wanted to measure how birds increased or decreased in terms of how often they were being observed on these checklists. after extreme weather. And we had a couple of ideas, biologically, of what it means for a bird to be observed more or less often after a week of extreme weather, after a month, or after a season. So this is all kind of speculative. We're trying to tease this out more with some later projects, but at this point, it's pretty speculative. But kind of at shorter time scales, like a week or a day, birds might be behaving a little bit differently, and kind of restricting their activity, when it's really hot or something like that. Over longer time scales, we might be talking about die-offs, things like that. And then over very long time scales, birds could shift their entire distributions in response to things like extreme weather. If it's just a region is just consistently too hot. So the first step was to take the eBird data and attach weather data at really fine scales. So what we used was this product through NASA. It's called DAMET. And so this is derived through satellites. What they do is they've produced since 1980 daily precipitation and temperature data for every single 1 kilometer cell in the entire United States, Canada, Mexico. So all of North America. And so we have this really, really detailed information going back, over 40 years. And so we can take this information and we know exactly what the weather was like for every single eBird checklist in North America, summarized over any period before the checklist that we. So we grabbed maximum daily temperature and precipitation, and we summarized them the week before each checklist, over 1 million eBird checklists that had been compiled in June. So we summarized them to the week before, the month before, and the 90-day period. So 3 different time periods. And we didn't just use the raw information on temperature and precipitation. We wanted to know, how extreme is this value of temperature and precipitation. So we got the anomalies. We got those values relative to the average at that location for every single checklist. So for example, we have the anomaly of temperature that week. It was 5 degrees above average that week, or 10 degrees above average that week, something like that, or that month, or that 90-day period. And so we did this for over 1 million eBird checklists in June. We chose June because it's a period of time where birds aren't really moving so much. They're pretty stable around their breeding areas, and so they're not going to be, moving to avoid this weather and things like that. So we can kind of boil it down to, are birds behaving differently, or are they dying in terms of what's happening after extreme weather. And so just to give a sense of what this looks like, this is kind of a typical day. If you look at the legend at the bottom, you can kind of interpret what temperature it is. This is the 2nd percentile, so an extreme cold day for June, even though it's really not all that cold because it's June. And then for the extreme heat in June, you see temperatures in most of the eastern US kind of hovering in the 90s to 100s range. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about modeling here, but I'm just going to kind of define a species distribution model as a model in which we relate the observation or the occurrence of birds on the checklists to a variety of environmental features, to kind of see which environmental features dictate whether a bird is likely to be found somewhere or when, right? So for us in this context, it was really important for us to look at those summaries of daily temperature and precipitation anomalies that happened before the checklist that I just described. How is bird observation linked to what those anomalies look like? And so we had all those anomalies, but we also had to control for a bunch of other different factors, right? Because if you're talking about something like a great egret, it doesn't matter how cold or warm or average it is. It's only going to be found if if there's water, if there's a wetlands, or if it's kind of a low elevation area. So we had to include things like land cover and topography in these models as well. Time of day is really important for some species. Vultures are seen more during midday, things like that. We also include observer effort and variation scores from eBird. So that's a little bit of controlling for some of those challenges with eBird that I talked about earlier. So we include a lot of the information about how long birding occurred, how far, what the distance traveled was, things like that. And so we did this for 109 different species, and we did this at the weekly, the monthly, or the 90-day scale. So we only included one of those temperature and precipitation metrics, depending on which scale it was. Just kind of briefly looking at this, we were interested in, how are birds affected by weather summarized over different periods. The permuted weather row, you can kind of ignore. We just looked at what happens if you randomize weather just to make sure the model wasn't inventing things on its own. So when you randomize the data, there's no effect, so that's good. So what we're looking at is the central column is temperature and the right column is precipitation. And so for temperature, whether it's heat that's summarized to weekly, monthly, or seasonal, you see about the same effect for whether or not birds are likely to be found in the area. And this is averaging across all bird species. But with precipitation, we found that the effect increased the further out you get. So that makes a lot of sense, right? Because you can't have a drought in 1 week. So there's no way that a drought should be influencing too much, or let's say it doesn't rain for a week. That shouldn't really influence what birds are doing too much. But if it doesn't rain for an entire month, then we start to see it. So kind of diving into individual responses for individual species. For a lot of these really common guys here that basically we'll see every day when they're around, we saw that the observations were totally independent of those temperature anomalies. Didn't matter which temporal scale, weekly, monthly, or seasonal. There's just no trend. But for some species, we found that when it got really warm, that's when we saw less observations of these species. And it was kind of a slow and steady, mild decline. But then once the anomalies got really high, so really extreme heat, we saw plummeting for these species, basically, and how often they were observed. But we saw the opposite for a couple other species, including a lot of these neotropical migrants. When it got to be very cold in quotes for June, those species started to kind of hunker down, and you didn't really see those anymore. And this is also true when we talk about precipitation. So when it got really dry over long periods of time, for a lot of these species, that some of these species hang out and breed adjacent to water and things like that. Might be a little water dependent. We found that when it got really dry for long periods of time, that's when they kind of disappeared off. But kind of instead of just going one by one across all these over 100 different species and try to draw conclusions, we grouped them all into single analyses. I won't go into the models here. We had additional models here, but we looked at a couple different features. So for example, how far do these birds travel in their migration? We figured that birds that migrate really far from the tropics, those might be a little bit more accustomed to hot, dry weather and things like that from the tropics. And so we figured that the species that were here year round might be a little bit less used to that extreme heat. And that's exactly what we found. So we found that the species that migrate either don't migrate or migrate only short distances within the US, all the way on the left side here on this figure, those ones had the more negative change in observations after extreme heat. So they really disappeared off the checklists, whereas the long distance migrants didn't so much. Another cool one I thought was the dependency on diet here. So the birds that eat invertebrates and kind of revolve around hunting insects, those were the ones that kind of still hung around even when it got to be extreme heat. But these birds that eat seeds or omnivores potentially, especially the seed eaters and fish eaters that aren't dependent on these insects that are flying around when it's warmer, those birds really hunkered down and weren't observed after extreme heat. So we thought that was pretty cool. We also generated these maps for each species in which we explored how the reaction is expected to change depending on where you are within your range. So for Carolina chickadee, for example, this is kind of a big responder to extreme heat. We saw that towards the interior of the range, the response is expected to be 0 to 10% occurring less often. But then when you get to the range edge, where things are a little bit less stressful, the climate's not quite as good, the habitat's not quite as good for a lot of species, that's where you saw that bigger drop off of 20 to 30% when it's extremely hot. So that was kind of cool. So hopefully, okay, I still have some time. I'm going to talk about another project in which we kind of shifted over to winter. So what I'm showing here is a bunch of papers that have been published talking about extreme weather and birds. And these are kind of the big ones at the time, at least. But all about heat waves, droughts, things like that. Summertime, very little about what birds are doing during the winter. And this is the same when we talk about graphics on social media as well. A lot of these are very, centered around things like hurricanes, droughts, heat waves, very little about the winter. But winter extreme weather, even though it might be a little bit counterintuitive, is actually increasing a lot with climate change. So I'll kind of explain what's happening. So the polar vortex is a disk of very cold air that rotates over the North Pole. And this happens all winter, every winter. And it's contained by the jet stream. So you can see that over there on the left. So we have this jet stream that's kind of formed by that contrast between that really cold air at the Arctic and that warmer air that's further south over the US. But as I said before, the Arctic is actually warming faster, especially in the winter, than the rest of the globe. And so that contrast isn't so contrasty as it used to be, right? So what happens is that the jet stream kind of starts to wobble, as you see there on the right. And so when this wobbling happens, you can kind of get a situation where that cold air moves south, and then that warm air moves north. And so that's exactly what happened. I think it was February 15th, 2021. You can see over the central US, including Arkansas, Texas, really insane -30°C. So that's like 55 Fahrenheit, something like that, anomalies, 55 degrees colder than usual. And if you look up at the North Pole, you'll see that that polar vortex that's moved south has been replaced by warm air. So there's this really, really hot air that's now over the North Pole. So it's actually warmer at the North Pole than in Houston on the state. So that's pretty insane for the middle of winter. And so I gotta give some credit to, so this is from CBS. They did a decent job covering this. And so I found this graphic that they had showing that that polar vortex got displaced by warm air up north. So we wanted to look at what birds are doing during the winter after extreme weather. And so we looked at a polar vortex that happened back in 2014 that was a little bit more confined to the Midwest. We also looked at a heat wave that was a little bit northeastern and eastern in 2015 as well. So in this case, we're not looking at, generally what birds are doing in response to really extreme anomalies over the course of 20 years. We're just looking at two specific extreme weather events that happened during the winter. So a little bit of a different way of tackling this. So in this case, we kind of wanted to see whether birds were changing their behavior or their movement, or if they were dying, by looking at what those responses look at through time, how they look through time. And I'll get to that in a second. I'll explain what that means in a second. In this case, what we did was we took for both of these weather events, we kind of confined, you can see the dark blue area of the map for the polar vortex on top, and then the dark red for the heat wave on the bottom. We confined the area to which we extracted the eBird data to just to those areas that were really affected. But we didn't want to just look at what was happening during those periods. We wanted to look at what happened during all the other years that eBird had data for, during those same dates, right? Because it could be that, during those same periods of the year, birds might, start to call more, or something like that. Like cardinals start singing, in late January, things like that. So we wanted to control for what was happening during all the other years during the same time. And so we called that the non-event period from 15 other years. And again, we ran very similar models to what I described the first time, except now our variable of interest in the models was looking at the date. So we were kind of interested in seeing how bird observation changed around this block of dates that was the extreme weather event. We wanted to see what happened before, during, and after. We did this for 41 species that we had enough data for. So this is what I was alluding to earlier. We wanted to kind of use the patterns surrounding that extreme weather event. So with time here, or date on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. So if we have, say, for just hypothetically, some bird species slightly declines over time in terms of its observations. just like, is less active as the winter goes on. And during other years, we wanted to see what was happening relative to that in the year of the extreme weather event. So if we saw a pattern like you see in the top left, we figured that might be, a decline that's just permanent, basically throughout the rest of the season. That's either a lot of mortality that we're seeing, or we're seeing movement out of the area. But if you look at the top right, that's a little bit of a different pattern where you see that kind of brief decline, but then a recovery. That would kind of signal that the birds moved out and then kind of moved back in, or that they just changed their behavior and kind of hunkered down for a bit and then went back to normal. And then there were two other scenarios we didn't really expect to see quite as much. One would be an actual increase in the observations after the extreme weather. And so that would be kind of birds moving into the area, which we thought would be a little strange. Or just no effect, just an identical pattern with, both the red extreme weather event and then the black the other years. So what we saw was actually really interesting and unexpected. So here are a couple examples of different species that we looked at with these models. And you can see with the red dots, so that's the extreme weather year. We saw a bit of a, plummeting of the abundance, so that's the number of individuals that we're seeing of the species on the checklists, relative to what was happening in the other years, which is black. And so this really fits in with our scenario of birds changing their behavior briefly and then going back to normal, or they moved out of the area and then came back, something like that. But for the other extreme weather event, that extreme heat, we saw completely different patterns from a lot of these species. So other years, not too much happening, but in the extreme weather year, we see that the bird occurrence on the checklists, goes up and then kind of stays high relative to the other years. So we thought that was really cool. And so when we talk about a winter heat wave, right, that actually is what we would call, really nice weather. It's, it's in the 60s and 70s, but for winter, that's considered a heat wave. We thought it might be potentially harmful to the birds because they, go through all of these changes physiologically in which they gain all these fat reserves and extra feathers and things like that to kind of insulate from the cold. So we thought, it might be a little too hot for them, but it wasn't. They actually were more out and about than usual after that. So this kind of fits with our, increase in behavior, in activity levels, or movement into the area for these guys. But this is what I think was the coolest part of this, and I'll kind of wrap up the research side of this. So in this case, we looked at 3 different traits across all the species. So the first one was body mass. We thought that the birds that are really small bodied would be really sensitive to all this weather. All these, 2-day to 4-day, 5-day weather events, because they don't have that kind of thermal inertia, is what we call it, to kind of maintain their body temperature for long periods, irrespective of what's happening over the course of a couple of days, right? And so we figured that these really small guys were kind of really, sensitive to these fluctuations in the environment. So that's exactly what we saw, which we thought was really cool. So the green and red bars, in this case, are the really short-term responses, 5 to 10 days. So 5 to 10 days after this polar vortex happened, the really small birds, that's the left side of the figure in both cases, a really negative response. So they really fell off the checklists during the polar vortex, but a really positive response. So occurring a lot more on checklists during the heat wave. And then those really large birds over on the right side, kind of straddling 0, so not too affected. This is what we call species thermal index. All it really is whether a species comes from a really cold climate or a warm climate. And so if you're really negative, so like -10, you're from a really cold climate. If you're from -6, you're from a really warm climate. And so we expected that those birds from a really warm climate would be more negatively affected, especially just after the polar vortex. And those birds from the really cold climates would be more affected by the heat, right? Because they're adapted to either really warm conditions if you're from a warm climate, cold conditions if you're from a cold. And so that's exactly what we saw here as well, which we thought was really cool. Um, those birds, that are just at -6 here in this thermal index, so they come from a warmer climate, they had the more negative response to the polar vortex 5 or 10 days after, and then for the heat wave, the opposite. So the cold adapted birds, or the cold climate birds, showed the negative response. And then finally here we looked at habitat preference. You can see the key at the bottom, but it was really kind of water birds versus everyone else here. So the water birds showing an opposite response, in which all the birds from all the other habitats exhibited a negative response to the polar vortex on top, but not the water birds. But then you have the exact opposite at the bottom, where the water birds showed the negative response, but the others didn't, or kind of a neutral response. So we thought this was really cool because all this polar vortex data and all this heat wave data, completely different data sets, completely different sets of eBird data. But we're finding the exact opposite patterns, where the same birds that respond negatively to one respond positively to the other, and vice versa. And then one little qualifier here is that there's a lot of redundancy between like water birds, really large birds, and birds from cold climates. So those are going to be ducks, geese, and things like that, versus all of these small passerines that are from further southern climates and kind of hang out either in open areas or forest areas and things like that. So it was a little bit difficult to kind of separate all three of these from each other, but we can at least say that those two different groups of birds responded very differently from each other and in opposite ways. So you might have been thinking a few slides ago, so that's kind of interesting. You didn't see any more evidence of mortality of birds just kind of like dropping off the checklists and then permanently staying off the checklists with the polar vortex. But we know from that February 2021 event that occurred in Texas and Arkansas, birds did take a hit, right? So especially bluebirds kind of famously, and robins. There are a couple others like eastern phoebe and roadrunners, I think, that were pretty well known for suffering some mortality during that polar vortex. And so I was kind of puzzled, why didn't we see this during the 2014 event? But then kind of looking at these two maps side by side, it kind of became a little bit more obvious. A lot of birds basically take refuge in the south during the winter to avoid colder weather. And so they're not really found in the Midwest. So things like bluebirds and phoebes are not really going to be found in that Midwest area that was affected in 2014. The birds that stay up there are really hardy and can really handle the cold. So it's possible that they just, weren't as bothered by that 2014 event that we looked at in the study, and just, altered their behavior for a few days and then went back to normal. Whereas, a lot of these birds where we live, during this 2021 event, they're expecting the winter to be mild in the south, bluebirds and phoebes and things like that. And so when an extreme weather, polar vortex hits like that, it's going to hurt them a lot. So just a couple take-home points. So in the first study, we found that short distance migrants and residents were the most sensitive and non-insect eaters. And then in the second study, we found that a lot of birds were temporarily observed less often after the polar vortex, but then kind of more permanently more often after the heat wave. But these responses were driven by things like body mass, geographic range, and habitat. So do I have more time? How much time do I have?
Yeah, keep going.
No, I'm great. Okay, I just have a couple slides. Yeah, so just a couple of things that we're working on right now. We're kind of diving in deeper rather than just kind of generalizing a response to a species across its entire range. We're looking at how birds are affected by the environment in different parts of their range differently, so different populations of birds. So we're using a couple of kind of cutting edge modeling techniques to look at that variation in space. And that one actually, we published kind of like a pilot project for that last fall. Another project, kind of an overarching theme of a couple projects that I'm working on right now at Yale. How do birds track their environmental conditions over the seasons, so between the summer and the winter? And then how are they tracking the conditions with their ranges, shifting their ranges in space with climate change? So moving north, moving higher elevations, things like that. And then finally, this is kind of a brand new project. We're looking at how biodiversity predictions for birds in space. So how many birds occur in this part of the map, in North America. How do these predictions change when you consider not just mean temperature and mean precipitation like most people do in the models, but you consider these extreme weather events. So that's something we're trying to include also. So we feel like this is kind of critical stuff because a lot of you might have seen this figure already. It's a really famous science paper by the Cornell Lab of Ecology, showing that we've lost about 3 billion birds in the US and Canada since 1970. And so that's 3 billion out of 12 billion, so about a quarter. And this has been pretty consistent across all these different habitats, deserts, different types of forests, grasslands, things like that. The only exception is wetlands due to a lot of the wetland restoration that's happened. So we've seen, pretty consistent declines. And so you'll see a lot of these figures, like what causes, bird mortality, what can we do about bird mortality? Cats, outdoor cats kill a lot of birds, and there's been a lot of discussion on birds about this topic as well. Building collisions, vehicle collisions are another big one. Those kill a lot of birds as well per year. But these are things that we can directly measure. So we can, directly take data on bird carcasses killed by cats or bird carcasses next to windows, things like that. It's a lot harder to figure out how many birds are killed by something like climate or habitat loss or things like that. That's a lot more difficult to measure. So you'll see a lot of the graphics like this, simple actions to help birds, addressing a lot of these direct causes of mortality. Keep your cats indoors, make windows safer, things like that. Native plants, which are really, really useful for your backyard or your local park, things like that, to help birds recover. But kind of when we zoom out to across the state, across the country, a lot of these issues like the climate and habitat loss and things like that become more important. So I'm not going to read through all this, but that's where it becomes more important to take different approaches to try to address climate change. So with that, I'll just thank some of the people who were really instrumental with a lot of this work. That's Ben Zuckerberg on the left. He's a faculty at University of Wisconsin. Daniel Fink is the head of status and trends, the head statistician at the Cornell Lab of Ecology. So they were both really heavily involved in guiding these projects. And then a lot of our data sources, NASA, MODIS, eBird, obviously, and the institutions and everything. All right, thanks.
Right.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Yes.
So we have, I think, some time for some questions. If anyone has a question you'd like to ask Jeremy, you can just unmute yourself and dive in or put it in the chat and I'll ask it. But while we're waiting on folks, one question that came to my mind was, has any of your research looked at elevation changes? Like I think about birds in the Mountain West, where seasonally there's a lot of elevation change, and how extreme weather events affect distribution there.
Yeah, so I have a collaboration going with someone else at Yale and USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service, which are providing us with a lot of really awesome data where the individual birds are actually tracked. So we didn't look at any kind of tracking data here. This is all from eBird. So obviously eBird is not keeping track of different individuals with the different checklists, but with that data type, we actually have trackers on a lot of these birds, mostly large birds, obviously. Although the trackers are getting a lot tinier and tinier every day, and they actually fit trackers to migrating butterflies recently. So songbirds aren't far away from that. But yeah, so we have all this tracking data for a bunch of bird and mammal species now. And so we can look at where they're actually going when an extreme heat wave occurs.
Mhm.
So we can see if they go up elevation, we can see if they go up latitude, we can see, if they're just going towards the coast or somewhere that's a little bit milder. And so we're in the midst of a project looking at a heat wave in 2021 in the West, seeing what a lot of these animals did after that heat wave occurred or during the heat wave.
Good, great.
Other questions?
That's very good.
Another quick one for you, Jeremy, that I have is, what is your, kind of in a practical way for all of us who make eBird checklist or participate in reading bird surveys, and what are some things that we could be doing to help make our contributions better for researchers like yourself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think at least for the data that I use, complete checklists are kind of like the most valuable thing. I really can't really make much use of the incomplete checklists at all. That's not to say that that's the case for everyone. The incomplete checklists are really valuable for noting like a rare or unusual species, for a local park or something like that, or for just our understanding of bird vagrancy and things like that. But when it comes to a lot of this work with extreme weather and climate change, it's really important to know that to be able to disentangle the idea that the observation was made, but the bird was not there versus there was no observation made, which is what a lot of people who work with mammals, reptiles, and amphibians and things like that, they struggle with that a lot and have to use a lot of additional statistics and techniques that are only partially effective, to kind of deal with not knowing, whether the observations were made or not, or whether or whether the individuals of that species were present or not. Kind of are unable to separate those two things. But with birds, we have it really easy that, eBird tells us the observation was there, was made, but there was no, that bird was not seen. So it's really useful.
Thanks.
I think.
John, do you want to ask your question, or? John talked to a couple of questions in here.
Okay.
So do birds learn and change their flyways?
With migration, or I mean,
I think so. John, do you want to clarify your?
There we go. I'm unmuted, hopefully now. Right.
Yes.
There you go. We can hear
I
you.
was wondering
Yeah.
if birds learn where there is and is not food available from temperature changes, and whether, because they need food during the migration, they learn and change their flyways. That was my first question. The second question was that you have not provided any as yet food overlays, whether land use or changes in insect availability, use of pesticides, etc., of closed off areas that they used, that too might be affecting eBird readings. And the last one was if there's any availability using pollen analysis for long-term, maybe 5,000 years of temperature variations, and seeing how birds could or would have handled temperature changes then.
Great. Thanks for those questions. So that's a lot. So I'll try to, if I can remember all of them.
Sorry.
The question of how no, it's fine. The question of how birds pick their migratory stopovers based on the food availability, that's a question that a lot of people have been working on, and a lot of people are still working on. Often done, for many fewer species at a time than this kind of work. Single species or a couple of related species at a time. And so obviously, these stopovers are very much driven by food availability.
Yeah.
But that's not this, it's not something that I've personally, but there's a lot of work being done. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of the main drivers, along with habitat, of where the birds are stopping during migration. You also mentioned, I think you mentioned how food availability drives responses to extreme weather.
Yep.
So that's a question that we've kicked around a bit, but the problem is that data is really, really hard to get. So we're doing these analyses across, an entire continent. And while we have, when we zoom into, really, really small areas of the map, we can be confident that there's almost always, especially in the Eastern US, going to be a bunch of eBird checklists that were compiled in those really small areas. There's much less data about what food is available, and especially since a lot of these birds have completely different food sources, that's gonna vary tremendously also and add a lot of complications.
Yeah, I noticed that from the different birds and their different diets, and I was thinking maybe people had noted, or there was noted, like mayfly, the hatching of mayfly is really temperature driven. Whether that's a link to food and a link to eBird readings, eBird sites.
Yeah, so that's exactly why we thought that the insect-eating birds really showed the most mild response to the extreme heat, is because a lot of this is very temperature dependent for these prey sources. But that's about the best we can do at this point.
Okay.
There is a group at Duke that's working on trying to generate like food maps. So trying to estimate across these large geographic areas what food availability there is for different food types.
Yes.
They're a very plant-centric group, so they're trying to do this with seed availability and things like that for finches. It's going to be much trickier with insects, since especially with insects, they're they fluctuate so much in time in terms of their availability too. So that gets a lot trickier. What was the last question?
The last one was pollen analysis for looking for long-term temperature variations, as opposed to our little blip that we're having at the moment.
Yeah, so obviously the data quality, once you go back, not just thousands of years, but even just pre-eBird to the 20th century, becomes very, very, very different. And so it becomes not really possible, honestly, to answer a lot of these extreme weather questions quite the same way. You just have many, many fewer data points surrounding extreme weather events in the past.
Tree rings show you weather, don't they? And then pollen can show you what was available and what was not. Or am I wrong here? Please talk to me.
So that's true, but they'll show you the weather at kind of like the yearly scale. So trying to understand, extreme weather fluctuations that occurred over a couple of days, like what we did here, that's going to be very difficult.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, sir.
Oh, you're welcome.
Well, Jeremy, I really appreciate you taking the time to come and present your research to us, and look forward to seeing what comes next.
Indeed.
Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.
So we're going to move now to our business session. So everyone give a round of applause to Dr. Cohen, and we will.
Good job.
We'll move on to that portion, and anyone who wants to stick around for the business portion is welcome to. But
everyone, feel free to email me. I don't know if my email was available in the email that was sent out, but
yeah, if you want to type it in the chat, that'd be great.
Megan, can I ask you a favor? Please, can you collar that group from Duke for some time in the future? Because that is going to be critical as things change.
Well, maybe I'll follow up
obviously.
Well, I'll follow up with Dr. Cohen and see if we can get some contact there. And
that'd be good. My thanks to you guys. I have another thing that I have to deal with. Appreciate it. Really do.
All right. Have a good evening.